Since Mart was small, all he ever dreamed about were horses. He saw them everywhere. Mart dreamed of becoming the world's best bronc rider. Mart and his siblings, Elf, Sigrid, Margaret, and Roy, attended Beaver Heights School near Spring Point, Alberta. Elf was the oldest in the family. Sigrid also went by the names of Celia or Helen. Mart is the center person in the doorway. We have Frank Paisley, Bill Walker, Margaret Thompson is in the sailor dress in the second row, and Roy Thompson is in the front beside the second boy to the right of Mart. The McLeod Spectator in July 22, 1913, said that the Beaver Creek races have become an annual event of great entertainment and great interest. There is always plenty of fun and some good horse riding and racing. The races held on Tuesday last were no exception. Quite a number of McLeod people attended and thoroughly enjoyed themselves. The only drawback was the rather disagreeable weather. There were 3 entries in the bucking contest: Dent, Mr. McAllister, and Thompson. Dent won the first prize and McAllister second. Thompson had one of the wildest bucking horses ever seen in Beaver Creek. He was bucked off, but the horse was soon caught, and after giving her half an hour's rest, Mart gave one of the best exhibitions seen for some time, riding his horse to a standstill. Mart Thompson took first place also in the boys' pony race. He is off to a grand start. Mart's mother Augusta relied on her sons, Mart, Alf, and Roy. It was a hard life, but satisfying as well. Alf was born the 4th of November, 1891 in Brooklyn, Kings, New York, United States. Roy was born in Shevlin, Minnesota, the 5th of April, 1905. Roy had been named after a baby who had died about 1896. Mart was born the 19th of February, 1899 in Pinewood, Buzzell Township, Beltrami County, Minnesota. Horses were a way of life. From the time he was small, Mart loved horses. He took part in several rodeo competitions of bronc riding. When Mart was about 13 years old, he joined his brother Elf as a range rider working for the North Fork Cattle Association. The cattle grazed on the Forest Reserve, which took in the area from Victory Creek on the south to the Northwest Branch on the north, what is now known as the P Ranches Summer Grazing Pasture, and to the summit of the BC border east to the Livingston Range. Mart and Elf looked after approximately 200 to 300 head of horses and to 3,800 to 4,000 head of cattle. In 1919, a severe winter set in early, before the cattle had been rounded up and brought out from the summer grazing pasture. The weather turned very cold with deep snow. Elf and Mart and their helpers loaded their pack horses with supplies and packed back as far as the BC border and started gathering the cattle. It was one of the most brutal winters ever experienced. Killing frost became common by the end of September. The first permanent snowfalls hit towards the end of October. Many farmers got caught with unthreshed grain. In several cases, the farmers were far from finished the cutting and stacking of their crops. Cold weather and snow hit with a vengeance during November. By the middle of the month, there was nearly a meter of snow on the ground. By the end of November, temperatures plunged to minus 37 degrees Celsius. The early onset of winter caught many people without adequate supplies of coal on hand. The local coal and firewood suppliers scrambled to bring in enough fuel to meet the sudden demand. The cold and snow continued through Christmas time and on into the new year. By the middle of January, the local thermometers were recording temperatures as low as -46 degrees Celsius. The cattle had to be gathered from the high country, or they would have starved to death before spring, if not brought out. Many perished from the cold. It was not an easy task with the snow so deep and the freezing temperatures to drive 3,800 to 4,000 head of cattle out of the mountains by way of the gap of Two Maycroft, where they were sorted by brands for ownership. The cold and miserable weather did not lift until the end of April. The boys' day wasn't finished after gathering cattle all day. Before putting the tent up, they would have to clear the snow away. Mart and Elf would pick a place where there were some old logs. They would then set them on fire. After the logs had burnt and dried and warmed the ground, they would then put up the tent and lay their bedrolls on the warm ground. When it was really cold, they would gather dead trees and bushes and build a big fire. At times it was so cold the cattle and horses would crowd in close to the fire to try and to get warm. During the long cold hours, the howling of the wolves could be heard. The boys were short on supplies, so Mart took some pack horses and rode 18 miles to the ranger station. Harry Nash was the ranger at that time. Visibility was poor as the howling wind whipped the snow around him. The wind bit into his exposed flesh. Mart's Stetson, pulled low over his eyes, sheltered his face. Suddenly Mart's horse stumbled and slid down the steep embankment towards the now frozen river. Heavily laden horses broke through snow-covered ice, breaking ropes, securing sacks of oats, bags of flour, and sacks of sugar. Plunging into the icy water, Mart salvaged everything he could. Mart was soaked to the skin. He refastened his supplies securely for the long, cold ride to camp. Shivering with cold and exhaustion, Mart rode into camp, unloaded his supplies, then headed to his tent to change his frozen clothes. Mart huddled close to the fire to get warm. He was soaked to the skin. He said it was a long, cold ride and that he was mighty glad to see the tent and the fire and get out of his frozen clothes. Later that winter, Mart went to Onaway, north of Edmonton, where his mother and stepfather, Jonas Johnson, were now living. The snow was very deep, and they were short of feed for the cattle, as there was not much but slough grass to feed the cattle. They had to use a team and sleigh for feeding. Mart and Jonas said the cattle were actually dying standing up. Most herds of cattle were literally starving. The snow was so deep that some of them didn't even fall over. Many perished from the cold. Mart never forgot the winter of 1919, nor did others who lived on ranches in those days. March and April failed to bring the usual relief of spring. There were several days when the temperatures fell as low as -30 to -35 degrees Celsius. The cold and miserable weather did not lift until the end of April. Then a new disaster hit. As large amounts of snow began to melt, the local rivers and creeks suddenly went into flooding. Elf rode over the summit at Tornado Pass to gather cattle which had drifted into BC. Claps of thunder were followed immediately by streaks of lightning, parting ominous heavy dark clouds. Abruptly, the saturated clouds dropped their load. Torrents of rain drenched the land and flooded creeks, stranding Elf in the wilderness backcountry. Elf followed the fording river to Nuttall as he couldn't get out, where he loaded his horse on a boxcar. There he unloaded his horse at Lundbreck and rode back up to the camp in the Gap. During the week Elf was gone, his diet consisted of berries. When Elf left, he was riding a wild horse. When he returned, it was a well-broken cow pony. Even as you get within a few hundred yards of the Rockies, it is difficult to see an opening in the massive wall. Suddenly, there is a narrow, bare pass between the water and the high perpendicular rocks of the mountain. Locals call it simply the Gap. A perfect description name for this deep breach in the massif of the Livingston Range that constitutes the sharply rising eastern wall of the Canadian Rockies in Alberta. Because the breach itself runs parallel to the mountain spine, the Livingston Gap is invisible until you are actually upon it. The Livingston Gap drains the north-south valley bounded on the east by the Livingston Range and on the west by the high rock ranges whose ridgelines defines the Continental Divide and the Alberta-British Columbia provincial boundary. In the early 1920s, Mart worked for the Dorkey Ranch, of which Jimmy McNabb was managing. It was about this time that Mart started competing in some rodeos, such as McLeod, Olson Creek, Pincher Creek, Calgary, and so on. He also rode and broke horses for the Horseshoe Dot Ranch. The owner of the ranch was Bob McNabb. As the McNabbs had an open grazing lease on the Blood Reserve, Mart spent several years helping his mother and working with his brother Elf. He also worked for Jim McNabb on the Cottonwood Ranch. One windy day, Mart and Jack McNabb were out riding. Mart was about to get off his horse to open the gate when Jack's horse spooked and ran into the side of Mart's horse. Well, Mart's spur hooked into Jack's wool shafts and the wreck was on. Mart and his horse went over the bank and into the creek. Mart was badly bruised and sore. His horse was picked up down on the Pagan Indian Reserve a day later. It was said that Mart was a debonair and daring bronc rider. He was great for clowning, and just for fun he would try his luck at riding a bronc sitting backwards, which really wasn't too successful, or try to roll a cigarette while a bronc would do its best to throw him. Riding winter and summer was his way of life. Mart never passed up a chance to challenge a bean bronc. Dark, heavy clouds threatened to rain. The impending storm didn't dampen the spirits of 2,000 spectators. Women with their papooses strapped on their backs followed travois pulled by the Indian men. Black Model Ts bounced across the tracks, which made a rough road. The chugging of the engines, the low-pitched honking mixed with bawling cattle and their calves, barking dogs, and restless wild horses. Over 2,000 spectators, cowboys and cowgirls in Stetson hats and blue jeans and shirts, Indian men in their headdresses and buckskin leggings and coats, Indian women in beaded buckskin dresses, colorfully ornamented with beads, crowded around the open arena. Wild horses were squeezed between two cowboys as hopeful contestants climbed on top of the writhing animals. As soon as the cowboy felt he was securely on, he nodded his head for the pickup men to let go. That was the signal. The animal exploded as he found his freedom. With violent, writhing, twisting contortions, he tried to expel the rider off his back. Midnight fulfilled Mart's every expectation. When he was picked up by the pickup men after about 100 yards of furious contortion, Mart said that he was grateful to find himself still aboard. Mart took first prize as a result of that ride. The purse was $30. In 1923 at the Olson Creek Annual Rodeo, with over 2,000 spectators in the stands of the Porcupine Hills Arena, and as printed in the McLeod Times June 28, 1923 publication, the greatest exhibition was given by Mart Thompson on the well-known outlaw bronc, Midnight, owned by Jim McNabb. Mart continued to thrill the rodeo spectators. He was among the competitors of the Calgary Stampede and was usually in the winning circle. Although Mart never drew such a great bucker as Midnight again, he did make some pretty sensational rides on such bucking horses as Tomboy and Weasel. Weasel was another McNabb horse. This was the same horse that killed Charlie King at the McLeod Rodeo in 1924. He was later named Deathbed after he became part of the Bernie Walsh bucking string. From the Olson Creek Rodeo, Alberta, Canada, where Mart was successful in riding Midnight, the famous bucking horse, to the Calgary Stampede, where he was successful in riding the broncs that were given him. Mart continued doing what he loved, riding horses and conquering the broncs. Mart's fame continued to grow as he tackled each bronc. By the time he reached the age of 25, the following ad appeared in the Lethbridge Herald. Riders wanted for British Rodeo. Apply to AP Day, Palliser Hotel, Calgary. This sparked the interest and excitement for all rodeo competitors. Ads were placed in newspapers the world over. The competition was tough. When the competitors applied, they were told that it was to be for the British Empire exhibition that was to open the 23rd of April, 1924. Excitement was high. Here was a chance to travel across the ocean and see the world. The race was on to see who was the best cowboy to compete in the World Exhibition in London, England. Each competitor hoped that they would be chosen to compete for the share of the prize money. The rodeo events for the British Empire exhibition would be held June 14th to June 28th, 1924. The prizes offered would be a total of $75,000, with individual prizes of $25 to $1,000. They were also competing for the King's Cup. Everything is being done to make it possible for the world's best riders and ropers to attend and take part in this great contest. A ship is being chartered and transportation and accommodations therein will be furnished free for all American, Canadian, and Mexican contestants, and their stock from New York to London and return to New York. Transportation arrangements are also being made from the various other countries to be represented. It was also stated that the share in the gate receipts would make it well worthwhile to be there, even if they were unlucky in the contests. All contestants who desired to participate in the competition at the 1924 Wembley Rodeo in London, England, met with Ad Day at the Palliser Hotel in Calgary, Alberta. Ad Day said that riders are like boxers. They must be young, experienced, and thoroughly trained. We don't have the great riders today that we had in the old days. The boys today have the stuff in them. They are game sports, but they don't get the opportunity. A rider in his early training must ride all types of wild horses so that when he goes into a competition, he will know how to grapple with a horse that follows any known tactics in the sport. On Monday, April 28th, Mark Thompson signed up to meet the other cowboys in New York on May 14th and sail with them from there to London, England. Their instructions are to bring all their equipment with them, so each and every man who rides will ride in his own saddle. The boys, all the competitors, would like to take a few horses from the range here and let the folks in England see what kind of horses grow on the prairies. The boys will leave McLeod about the 9th of May. Free transportation will be furnished to and from the races, with all expenses allowed for. These will take away the best riders from the Jubilee in McLeod, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, but if they can make the trip back, they will do it. Weeping willows, pines, and poplars passed as in a blur, low sprawling bungalow ranches on fields of patchwork quilts. For some it was the first time to travel by rail. For all, it was the first stage for the trip to England and the coveted prize, the King's Cup. The piercing whistle announced the arrival of the locomotive as the whoosh of the wheels ground to a stop at the train station in Winnipeg, Alberta, Canada. Mart Thompson, along with the other whooping and hollering competitors, disembarked to cheering crowds. People pushed and shoved to get near, to shake the hands of the cowboys to wish them luck. The trip from Calgary to Winnipeg was exhilarating. The eastbound Canadian Pacific train left Calgary May 14, 1924. 14 rodeo experts from Alberta and Saskatchewan are on their way to Wembley Park for the British Empire exhibition. Excitement and anticipation were high. When would the train pull out? It seemed to take forever. Soon, all aboard, could be heard above the din of the exuberant cowboys' yee-haw! Whoopee! The whistle blew. The smoke from the steam engine hung heavy in the air. The sharp cat call caught the passengers' attention. Would you mind posing for a photo? Everyone jostled into position. Men with hats pulled low, men in white, wide-brimmed Stetsons with gray suits, men in black, wide-brimmed Stetsons with dark suits, one with a cap. Jostling to get a spot, 2 rows were formed, some standing on the stairs to the coach, with the others in front on the platform. Squeeze a little tighter. I can't see all of you through the viewfinder. Strawberry Red Wall and Mrs. Wall from Calgary, C.T. Leash from Black Diamond, Alberta, R. Hayes from the Okanagan, British Columbia, Harry Walsh, E. Havens, and Pete Vandermeer, all of Calgary, W. Armsden from Cochrane, Alberta, C. D. Perrin and Edwin P. Perrin, and R. T. Drury, all of Maple Creek, Saskatchewan, Mart Thompson from Fort Macleod, Alberta, and Walt Whitney from Lethbridge, Alberta, and Kelly Leach from Okotoks, Alberta, crowded and bunched closer together. These were all champions who had proven themselves worthy of being chosen for the upcoming contest in England. Each felt that they would be the ones to be declared the world champion. That's better. Hold still. Holding the leather handle of the maroon leather square box, the party came into focus. As the lever was depressed, the shutter tripped to advance the film. Got it. Let's call for New York. The conductor's voice cut into the cool morning air. Everybody clambered aboard and found their seats. New York, London, here we come. Let's go. Hooting and hollering could be heard above the roar of the crowds. People could be heard. Good luck. Show those Brits what the West is made of. In curious contrast, as the plane pulled out, Sir John Martin Harvey stood at the rear observation platform, gracefully leaning on his stick, a quiet, half-wistful smile lingering about his lips as he gazed on receding Winnipeg, while up in the front the air was veritably quivering with staccato yells of "Let's go! Let's go!" emitted by the 14 confident young men. A solitary figure, Sir John Martin Harvey, watched with a half-wistful smile as the cheering crowds in Winnipeg disappeared. I wonder what will happen next. Traveling with this lot will be very interesting and adventurous. There should be lots of action on the ship. Every one of the 14 is a range-bred, dyed-in-the-wool, number 1 hard bronc buster. Included in the party is Strawberry Red, known when off his horse as Mr. Wall. Mr. Wall does not dress up to his reputation, for he sports tan Oxfords, a collar and tie, and a soft cap. Yet he's a humdinger in his own hometown. Bulldogging a husky steer to his knees is a mild before-breakfast recreation to him, and a 40-foot lariat will obey his slightest wish. Accompanying Mr. Strawberry Red is Mrs. Strawberry Red, and the pleasant little lady looks forward to a big time over there. Most of them were garbed in the inevitable huge Stetson hats and high-heeled riding boots, rolling the equably inevitable pill. Some had picturesque buckskin jackets on, but even on those whose clothes bore no indication of their work, there was an unmistakable impression of the range. Each of them was a prize winner, and the whole formed the cream of the rough riding Alberta and Saskatchewan, the finest riders, ropers, and bulldoggers the prairies have to offer, selected by competent judges headed by Mr. Day, a stockman prominent in stampede circles in Calgary. Listening to the rumbling of the tracks, the screeching of brakes, the whistle blowing, and the hum of the engine, the loud rhythmic chugging noise as the train moved along the tracks, the rumbling noise of the engine and the clickety-clack as train wheels rolled over the tracks at night, lulled Mark as he drifted into sleep. His mind took him back as he remembered his mother Augusta, how she had sacrificed, being there and supported him as he followed his dreams. He remembered his dear, sweet Edna Pearl McNabb, whom he hoped would someday become his wife. How he loved and missed them. Edna Pearl, or Molly, as Mort loved to call her, was unable to join him in this adventure, as she had to stay home to look after her mother, Mary Casson Barker, who was ill. He remembered how he promised his sweet Molly that he would visit her Uncle George Heathcote Barker in England. Molly told Mark that she never got to meet her grandparents. He fell asleep remembering Molly's story of her family. Molly's mother, Mary Casson Barker, was born the 6th of May, 1865, in Liverpool, Lancashire, England. Her parents were William Wilton Barker and Elizabeth Heathcote. Mary Casson Barker emigrated in 1888. She came to Canada in 1889 and arrived in Lethbridge April 13, 1889. She left 3 days later to take up her work on the Indian Reserve at Cardston at the mission, which later became St. Paul's Residential School. From the start of her mission work, Mary worked hard to help the Indian children. Mary grew up in Liverpool, England. Her family owned 5 estates. Their home in England was close to the water. As a child, she would play in the basement where there was a maze of tunnels. These were roped off. The children were not permitted to go past this rope. Being adventurous, Mary did go past the rope. Molly said that her mother, Mary Casson Barker, would play in the tunnels of the castle where she grew up. One day, Mary met this interesting stranger. She saw a man in buckskin. He told her to go back. She would get lost. His name was the Scarlet Pimpernel. Mary later recounted, "I thought that he had been to Canada." These were the tunnels that the Scarlet Pimpernel used when he smuggled the aristocrats from France to save them from the guillotine and Marie Antoinette during the French Revolution. London Bridge was not far distant from the castle. The tunnels opened to the River Thames, where under cover at night he would help the aristocrats escape to safety. Mary also said that we are related to the Scarlet Pimpernel. Mary is the middle child. She is the youngest surviving child. She always wanted to go to India. When the opportunity came to teach the Indians at the mission in Canada, she jumped at the chance. In her mind, she thought that she was going to India. The story is told that Robert was bringing in cattle. The cattle were running around. A little child was in the path of these cattle, and Mary saw the child. She ran and grabbed the child to take him out of danger. Robert saw this as he was one of the cowboys working with the cattle. He thought to himself that this was a very brave woman. He wanted to marry her. After their courtship, Mary and Robert Burgess McNabb were married December 16, 1891 in Fort Macleod, Alberta, Canada. They had 7 children during their marriage. Mary Casson Barker McNabb died on November 5, 1956 in Fort Macleod, Alberta, Canada at the age of 91. Mary was teaching school on the reserve. In those days, the Indians were still hostile. As an incentive, Mary would give the children a cookie if they behaved and did their work. It was cool, so she went out to gather wood for the fire. She had gathered an armful. A piece of wood fell. Just as she bent down to pick up the fallen piece, an arrow whizzed over her, hitting the tree behind her. A boy had not received a cookie because he was misbehaving. If Mary had not bent down at that very moment, she would have been killed. Mary recounted a time when the Indians were camped on the Belly River. There was an Indian baby who was quite sick with colic. The adults were passing this baby back and forth over the flames of the fire to burn the demon out. It was in the winter. The river had frozen over. Mary went across the ice, grabbed the baby, and ran back to the mission. The Indians chased her. As the Indians were following her across the river, their combined weight broke the ice. They never did catch her. She nursed the baby back to health. She then returned the baby. Mary said that she was of royal blood. Her family has 5 wax seals: Pimpernel, additional estates, Black Hawk in Scotland. This was the summer cottage. They had a number of homes throughout England. The Barker family had 5 coats of arms and 5 wax seals. The Scarlet Pimpernel is one of the family's coat of arms. The wax seal was the pimpernel flower. The Heathcote coat of arms, the wax seal was a fist, beat down to pick up, and the Black Hawk in Scotland coat of arms, with 2 additional coats of seals and arms. Molly's grandfather, William Wilton Barker, had been born the 13th of May, 1827, in Buenos Aires, Argentina, when his father, George Samuel Dyson Barker, was a merchant. Her grandfather, William Barker, died the 23rd of April, 1900, in Derby, Derbyshire, England. Molly's grandmother, Elizabeth Heathcote Barker, was born the 29th of November, 1828, in Derby, Derbyshire, England, and died the 7th of March, 1910, in Poulton, Crowborough, England. Mart thought it would certainly be nice to visit George Barker while in England. The screeching of brakes, the whistle blowing, and the hum of the engine, the loud, rhythmic chugging noise as the train moved along the tracks, the rumbling noise of the engine and the clickety-clack as train wheels rolled over the tracks, with the excited conversation of the cowboys, woke Mart. The first thought on his mind was that he wished his sweetheart Molly could be here to experience this wonderful adventure. Soon the waiters were bringing the cowboys breakfast. Looking out the window, the scenery was rapidly changing to more homes and businesses and to less open spaces. Mart, along with the other contestants, dug in. Who knew when they would have a chance to eat again? They would be pulling into New York later this morning. Excitement was high. Everyone was speaking at once. Here was a chance to travel across the ocean and to see the world. At last, the train rumbled into New York, its whistle blowing as the wheels screeched to a stop. It was hectic as the cowboys gathered their luggage intact and disembarked from the coaches. The bawling of the cattle and the neighing of the horses was a cacophony of sound that was music to their ears. The cowboys checked the condition and needs of the livestock. They herded the cattle and horses to the corrals located on the docks, where they were prepared to be loaded into the cargo hold of the ship. Going through customs was an experience in itself. They would need to prepare to go through customs when they arrived in England. People were anxiously engaged, making sure that they had everything they needed to board the ship, jostling and waiting in line, waiting their turn. More than 100 cowboys from Alberta, Saskatchewan, British Columbia, Manitoba, Texas, Wyoming, and other states began the last lap of their journey to London, where they will perform in the Rodeo of Wembley during June. It was the first time some of the riders had been aboard ship, and they evinced much curiosity in the riggings and fittings of their floating home for the next 7 or 8 days. When the cowboys went across, the seas were very violent. Waves were higher than the decks. The passage was very rough. Even so, they were not sorry. They had made it. They were the best of the best. They were on their way to an exciting adventure. Each one was confident that they would be the victor and bring home the King's Cup. There was never a lack of excitement on board. Cowboys and cowgirls traveling to Wembley Rodeo were training seriously for the event. Many rushed 100 times around the top deck before breakfast. There were boxing bouts on the deck. Two opponents lost their tempers and lashed out at each other, but the umpire stopped the bout. Later, two cowboys who accused each other of crooked play fought fiercely over a game of dice. One struck his accuser in the face. He was immediately seized by the hair and dragged into the space outside the lounge, where a long stand-up fight took place. Both were badly knocked about, but eventually they shook hands. Afterwards, they produced their lassos and practiced on the deck chairs. The cowboys are full of good humor and are completely under the control of their wives, whose slightest wish instantly becomes law. The wife and ex-wife of one cowboy are traveling on the Menominee. Cowboy Roach, who divorced his wife Ruth, married his present wife Lois, a pretty girl with fair curly hair and blue eyes. His former wife married Cowboy Richardson. All four are now traveling together and are greatly interested in each other's happiness. Cowboy Roach will be the arena director at Wembley. Mrs. Richardson will compete in the bronc events. Pitiable scents were witnessed yesterday. The white-faced champions lay rigid on deck chairs, muffled in rugs and blankets. Low groans broke the deathly silence. The heavy swell and pouring rain had conquered the redoubtable riders. Many expressed the determination to settle in England in preference to the return voyage. The warriors' horses are sailing well, especially Tajano, the Prince of Wales Mustang. Feeding lions at the zoo is less perilous than feeding the fierce broncs traveling in the Menominee for the Wembley Rodeo. Picked men who take them their daily food are always on the alert for a sudden bite or kick. The animals batter the wooden stable partitions with incredible force. One of the most remarkable riders, Shandy Woods, resembles Captain Hook of Peter Pan fame. He has only his left arm, and a steel hook does duty for the other. He is, nevertheless, one of the finest steer ropers in America. When approaching a steer, he wraps the horse reins around the hook and flings a lasso with his left hand. He can even throw a lasso with his hook hand. He supports himself on deck during rough weather by hooking himself to his friends, who solemnly shake the hook with greeting him. The Menominee is now an exact replica of a Wild West saloon or floating ranch. The cowboys sprawl on the floor playing dice, while their wives or girlfriends dance to the gramophone or piano. They have now forsaken their breeches for America's latest fashions: red stockings, silk neckties, and black silk coats. One of the cowgirls appeared today in pear-shaped pearl earrings, a pearl necklace, and a costume worthy of a fashionable Paris race meeting, while others wore costly afternoon frocks. A cowboy who is a fine pianist and a cowgirl saxophonist provided the music today for dances in the Wild West style. Numerous cowboys, however, were absent because of their illness of being seasick, and they have absented themselves, for they have gone down like ninepins in the heavy weather encountered since leaving the American coast. Vandermeer, the Canadian champion bronc rider, produced a lasso at lunch and provided the passengers traveling in the Menominee to the Wembley Rodeo with a vivid display of lasso skill. He roped the rolls, knives, forks, and serviettes. An officer carrying meat to his mouth on a fork found this food suddenly snatched from his grasp. His final feat was the lassoing of a single pea. 7 champion cowgirls are competing in the bronc riding. This event will produce and provide numerous thrills. There are 56 entries for the wild horse race, 36 for the steer ropers, 43 for the bronc riders, 22 for the steer wrestling, and 35 for the horse swimming race across the Thames. Some may cancel their entry for the swimming race, but their appearance in the arena at Wembley is compulsory for all other contests. The contestants from the Menominee total 121. Cowgirls' fashions would drive a dress designer to despair. The girls, who are all beautiful, wear weird and costly clothes. One appeared at lunch in a pink silk boudoir cap. Most cowgirls appear at breakfast wearing an afternoon hats and sleeveless frocks. All wear immense diamond and platinum rings. One girl sauntered to the bathroom in black silk pajamas. Many are going to Paris to buy more clothes before the rodeo opens. The indulgent cowboy husbands, wearing rags themselves, insist on their wives appearing at all times in full finery. There is a strange contrast in the outfits of the husbands and wives. The cowgirls rouge to excess, while the husbands are bronzed and often unshaven. The cowgirl temperament is similar to that of a prima donna. There was a frantic call for the doctor at the slightest ache or pain. The SS Menominee finally docked at the Royal Albert's Docks in London, England on June 5, 1924. They had arrived. Excitement was high. Wembley Stadium was the next stop. Look out! Here we come! Nearly 300 horses, at least a quarter of the number wild and unbroke, will figure in the International Rodeo at Wembley. With the animals, there traveled 130 of the competitors, mainly Mexicans, Americans, and Canadians, and their quest is a share of a total prize money bound of no less than £20,000. The contracts from all over the world number 200, and 4 of them are London men. Speaking to a number of press representatives yesterday, Mr. C.B. Cochran impressed the idea that the fortnight's tournament he has arranged is in no sense a circus or wild cowboy performance, but a serious athletic contest, carrying with it coveted championships and lucrative prizes. The competitors, in fact, have to maintain themselves during their stay, for the only expense that the promoters are defraying for them is that of their sea transportation to England. They are the pick of the ranchers whose recreation it is to pit their courage against the unbridled fierceness of wild horses and cattle, and that fact alone guarantees that the spectacle will not merely be novel but thrilling. The horse itself knows no law but to get rid of its rider in quick time by all sorts of bucking and kicking and swerving. And the rider knows only that these wild horses have extraordinary cunning, and in their repertory of tricks, gentleness certainly never finds any place. 200 American cowpunchers Friday gave London the biggest sensation of its life by sheer noise. Arriving from Tilbury at the Liverpool station Friday morning, they clambered aboard a waiting fleet of 6 char-a-bancs and proceeded to upset Fleet Street, the Strand and the West, and generally with that what the plaintive English guide called prairie calls, as that section has never been disturbed before. Riding in the folded tops in the rear of the char-a-bancs, sextets of cowboys wielded their ropes and deftly removed innumerable silk hats from the heads of bank clerks and others gathered to welcome them in the narrow streets in the neighborhood of the Bank of England. The greatest interest expressed by the cowboys during their 12-mile trip to Wembley came when they sighted the Marble Arch entrance to Hyde Park and learned that the king rides there daily at 8 in the morning. All the cowgirls and most of their consorts have enthusiastically declared that they are going to line up in Rotten Row and say howdy to the top-hand rider of the British Empire. The best of cowboys and cowgirls the world over had finally arrived. Their skills would be taken to the extreme to prove that they would be the ones to be the champions of the world in their various categories and take home the King's Cup to their country. Now it was time to pit their best against that of the others in the world. From bronc riding to being entertained by royalty, the adventure had begun. Their hard work had paid off. This is what they had wanted. Competing in the British Imperial Exhibition at Wembley Rodeo was everyone's dream. Each wanted to bring home the King's Cup. The race was on. The exhibition was large, varied, and exciting, offering elephants, butter sculptures, and miniature railways, among much else. It proved popular with the British public, attracting more than 25 million visitors. The preparations for the exhibition involved a great deal of development in the Wembley Park area of London. The area had been chosen because it was said to be extremely accessible from all parts of the country, taking only 10 minutes by train from either Marylebone or Baker Street stations. The new Empire Stadium was built especially for the exhibition. Roads were widened and a new railway station was built on the site itself. Covering over 200 acres, the exhibition site included pavilions displaying the produce, industries, and crafts of different colonies and dominions. These were developed and organized by the respective colonial governments. 56 out of 58 territories participated with their displays and pavilions. There were also over 40 different cafes, restaurants, and places of refreshment, a children's creche, and the Treasure Island attraction, which boasted a miniature train. There are the pelts and the furs and the fishery exhibits of Newfoundland, the teas and the rubbers and the spices in the towered pavilion of Ceylon, the quaint native street of Hong Kong with the Chinese at work, and all the evidences of the great Pacific trade which the activities of Hong Kong represent, the rubber production demonstrations in Malaya, the gold mines of British Guiana. Then on top of all of these, the walled city of West Africa, with its Nigeria, Gold Coast, and Sierra Leone buildings, the tropical products of the West Indies, the big game, the industries, and the native exhibits of East Africa, the romantic illustrations of life in Fiji. Organizations such as the Trade Unions Congress and Labor Party Executive recorded their frustration with what they saw as a fundamental contradiction between the principles of the Commonwealth and the working conditions of the fair. The 1924 Wembley strike began with a group of electricians protesting non-union labor employed by exhibition organizers, but the protests soon expanded to encompass wage disputes and workplace safety. It was part of a larger effort by labor groups to develop the power of unions across geographic areas and sectors, and the electricians were soon joined by plasters and carpenters. As was the case with many collective actions of the time, the local police force was called in to protect the exhibition grounds. This picture of this strike shows exhibition workers milling around a construction site strewn with raw stone slabs, lumber, and dirt. A large group of policemen looms above them. In the background, the skeletal towers of various pavilions under construction highlight the stakes of the conflict. When C.B. Cochrane was first approached by officials of the British Empire exhibition several months ago, he felt like the average Englishman, that their rodeo business was merely another form of Wild West show of which Londoners have had a surfeit for 30 years. Now that I understand what this championship cowboy contest really is, I am confident it will be one outstanding sensation of the whole exhibition. To begin with, it is the first time an international rodeo has ever been staged, and it will be directly international, inasmuch as the competitors come from Argentina, Australia, South Africa, and Canada, as well as the United States and Mexico. From countries outside the United States, the entries total about 100, with 250 American cowpunchers, bringing the competitors up to 350. The contest will continue for 13 days, from June 14th to June 28th, with performances in the afternoon and evening. Accommodations for 150,000 spectators will make possible a total attendance of 3,500,000. The prize money already posted totals $100,000. In the case of the Americans and Canadians, they must pay their own way to New York. The pay for the cost of transportation of their horses with round-trip tickets from New York to London is guaranteed by the management. Tex Austin is in charge of the Americans and of the show and the Canadians, and is now buying 300 wild steers and wild horses. We are chartering a steamship which will depart from New York in the middle of May. The passengers include 24 cowgirls. A condition has been placed on the permit for the cattle to be landed in England by the Minister of Agriculture, under which they will be slaughtered at the end of the competition and their carcasses given to the unemployed for food. The Maple Creek riders who have signed contracts are Alex Laframboise, Buck Drury, Bill Jameson, Edwin Perrin, C.D. Perrin, and Joe LaValle. Medicine Hat will send George Hutchinson, Cecil DeVille, Joe Foster, Bob Page, and Joe Jacobson. Strawberry or Ed E.A. Wall and Pete Vandermeer from Calgary, and Mark Thompson from Fort Macleod. Mr. Day said that he looks for some of our Canadian boys to come out of the Imperial Rodeo as champions. He said our fellows have the pluck, the cleverness, the daring, and the sticking qualities. I believe I have under contract now the finest riders in Western Canada, and I am banking on them to uphold the honor of the Dominion. The fares of the riders both ways will be paid by management, and they will all be given a chance of picking up more than enough money to see them through. The range men are keen on making the trip. I even have British boys coming to me. They have been here a few years and see in this offer a glorious chance to go home for the trip. As soon as they walk across the room, I know they are no cowmen. They don't have to speak, drawled Mr. Daly, smiling. The grand entry is the exciting opening to each and every Wembley rodeo performance, in which all rodeo contestants participated to the delight of the crowd. The first grand entry was Saturday, June 14, 1924. 150 cowboys and cowgirls rode into the arena under the leadership of Tex Austin, who was 6 feet tall. None of the competitors was a professional. All had paid their own traveling expenses except for the water transport, and their only hope of reward lay in their ability to win a prize in the bronc riding, bulldogging, or relay racing competitions. Thus, there was a bronc riding competition on Saturday at 2:30 with the first prize of 20 pounds, every point gained and counting in the competition for the International Championship, a title which carries a first prize of 300 pounds. The 150 riders, all moving as if they were parts of a single whole, made up a delightful spectacle, with their shaggy chaps, their gay shirts, their wide-awake hats, and their coiled lariats. 5 minutes later, they left the stadium clear for the bareback riding competition, which was the opening thrill of the rodeo. As a fact, with saddle briding, it's really more difficult than bareback, and the conventions are stricter. Of the 12 cowboys who competed with saddle buck jumping on Saturday, 6 were thrown within a minute. Each horse was ridden with a plain halter and one rein, and the rider was not allowed to knot the rope or wrap it around his hand. The rodeo rules continue. Riders must hold the rein at least 6 inches above the horse's neck. The rider must leave the starting place with both feet in the stirrups and both boots against the shoulders. They must touch front first 5 jumps and then touch high behind. The rider must ride with one hand free and not change hands on the rein. Any of the following offenses disqualifies a rider: being bucked off, changing hands on the rein, wrapping the rein around the hand, losing a stirrup, pulling leather, which is when a saddle bronc rider touches any part of the saddle with their free hand during the 8-second ride, causing disqualification, failing to leave the starting place with boots against the shoulder, and not being ready to ride when called upon. 9 cowboys each mounted a bucking bronc without a saddle and stuck to it until the judges signified to their satisfaction that the outlaw was tamed, when the rider was dexterously lifted from the bucking horse by a cowboy friend and taken to safety. It is possible that Mark Thompson will bring home the bigger share and bigger portion of the prize money, as he has been riding since he was able to walk, and he has ridden all of the bad horses in southern Alberta. His friends are expecting to see the King's Cup hanging up in the McLeod as soon as he comes back. The riders that were chosen to go to the Wembley Rodeo to represent Canada were selected from the champions determined at the Calgary Stampede July 7th through the 14th on 1923. Additional Canadian riders were Elmer Jamieson of Maple Creek, Saskatchewan, Jack Purnell of Wolford, Alberta, Andy and Arthur Lund of Raymond, Alberta, F.G. Hutchison of Medicine Hat, and Mark Thompson, as mentioned previously, from Fort Macleod, and Walt Whitney of Lethbridge. Even more to the fancy of the Wembley crowd was the girls' trick riding. Going at full gallop from one end of the vast arena to the other, a girl stood upright on her horse's back, or crawled under its belly and regained her saddle on the other side. Vera McGinnis quickly established her popularity with the crowd by her daredevil tricks. Before the rodeo fortnight ends, she will be as famous as a musical comedy star, and the Johnnies will know her as Vera. Very interesting, too, was the aid the cowgirls gave to the lariat throwers. Galloping at full speed, they allowed the cowboys to rope them as they passed, and the cowboys never seemed to miss. Each time the lariat flew, a horse and rider were brought to a standstill. One cowboy and cowgirl pirouetted around the stadium, the man curling his lariat around himself and his companion in a strange rope dance. Tom Kernan, the world's champion with the lasso, actually stood on his head with the loop of the lariat on the ground in front of him, and yet was able to catch 2 riders as they galloped past. Finally, using 2 ropes, Kernan caught both rider and horse as they swept past, one lariat encircling the horse's head and the other the cowgirl's body. At the time, the exhibition was the largest show of its kind ever held. As indicated, a number of American and Wyoming cowboys joined their Canadian, South African, and Australian counterparts at the exhibition. Not counting American cowboys, 56 of the nations of the British Commonwealth and Empire were represented. The purposes of the exhibition was to stimulate trade, strengthen bonds that bind England to meet on common ground and learn to know each other better. American rodeo cowboys and cowgirls made a lasting impression upon Londoners when they arrived at the capital of the British Commonwealth en route for the Wembley exhibition. One cowboy sitting on the hood of an automobile yelled, "I want to rope a red-headed goyle." He did, but she turned out to be a blonde, so he let her go. Every silk hat within a rope's length was regarded as legitimate prey, and the Londoners took it all with marked good humor. One body of men who quite overawed the excited cow people were the London bobbies. They were not molested. The rodeo was the most popular aspect of the exhibition. Bronco busting was open to amateur riders. In the first 3 days, a score of British riders tried riding the broncs. Only one stayed on long enough to collect any money. Yet so many attempted to enter the contest that the list had to be closed. The first performance of the rodeo took place in the Wembley Stadium on Saturday afternoon in the presence of upwards of 80,000 people, who followed every incident with a keen attention and applauded tumultuously. There were plenty of thrills, and it was, from first to last, an engrossing and astonishing show. Under championship rules, a rider must spur the horse under the shoulders, then back kick. He must hold the reins in one hand only, without changing hands. He mustn't lose a stirrup. In other words, he must show that he is the master of the horse. Simply sticking on isn't enough. Amongst the amateurs who entered the stadium arena, intent on trying for the £10 offered to anyone sticking on a bucking bronc, was a large and genial bluejacket with the most expansive paws and widest trousers ever seen by the management. He was not regarded quite seriously, sailors being notoriously bad horsemen, but he insisted on having a shot, and was duly mounted, hoisted by human derricks onto the back of a saddled bronc with a wicked eye. To the amazement of the cowboys and the delirious joy of the crowd, the bluejacket rode the bronc in real professional style, never quitting the saddle an inch, and gaily holding one hand aloft in the approved manner. He was handed his £10 and heartily congratulated. "Thanks," said he. "Before I joined the Navy for the war, I spent 8 years on a Texas ranch. Thought I hadn't lost the knack." Steer wrestling and steer roping was one of amazing skill. In steer roping, a white tape was laid at the edge of the grass, 20 yards from the pen in which the steer was enclosed. The cowboy was not allowed to throw his lariat until the liberated steer crossed the tape. The first steer was a heavy white Hereford, weighing about 70 stone. Peach Shaw, the cowboy, followed at full gallop, roped the steer by the neck, threw it heavily by entangling its legs with a lariat, and then dismounted and hog-tied the big beast. The operation took 1 minute and 25 seconds, little enough as it seemed, though the world's record is slightly lower. A fact, Bob Crosby roped and tied a steer in 27 seconds Saturday afternoon, amid the cheers of the vast crowd and the approving cries of his wife and small daughter, "Oh, you Bob," and "Crosby wins." Again and again the steer was roped and thrown, but regained their feet and escaped. One all-red steer had to be thrown 4 times, and yet the final roping and hog-tying was accomplished in 1 minute 44 seconds. It would be dishonest to pretend that the steer liked the ordeal. Tex Austin and the rodeo authorities were well advised to stop the steer roping before the public outcry became clamorous. Steer wrestling belongs to another category. Here a man weighing about 11 or 12 stone pits his endurance and wits against a bull weighing 60 or 70 stones. The odds are well in favor of the bull. The cowboy galloped shoulder to shoulder with the steer and then made a devil-may-care leap from his horse onto the steer's shoulders. Holding on to the creature's horns, he brought the steer to a standstill. Then commenced a Herculean struggle to throw the steer upon its back, which had to be accomplished within 3 minutes. Otherwise, victory went to the steer. On Saturday afternoon, Bob Askin put his steer over in 30 4/5 seconds, and Jim Massey accomplished the feat in 27 2/5 seconds. Using the horns as a lever, the cowboy twisted the head of his steer until it was thrown off balance, being careful that the steer in falling did not gore or crush himself. The rodeo was in for a rough ride. First, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty brought criminal charges against the show's manager, Charles Cochran, and several cowboys. Cochran bounded by attempting to have the Sun newspaper held in contempt for publishing details relating to the upcoming hearing on the Royal Society's action. The controversy spilled over into the House of Commons, where Prime Minister Baldwin, in discussing the situation in Mexico, where British-owned property had been seized, was interrupted by having to answer questions about the rodeo. Ultimately, the steer roping contest had to be held behind locked gates. Nevertheless, the show attracted crowds as large as 100,000 people. In one instance, one member of the audience who booed the performance was forcibly ejected by fellow members of the audience. Notwithstanding its popularity, the Wembley Rodeo, however, was not to be repeated for another 9 years. The rodeo ends with a wild horse race. The final event of the program has a wild horse race in which the saddling of broncs is done in the open, or an attempt is made to do it. For most of the unruly horses bolt away from the men holding them, and few are actually saddled up for the race. A dozen cowboys enter the arena, saddle and mount the broncs. The first to ride one past a line in the middle wins. Some are thrown at once. There is utter confusion, and luck alone, it seems, determines which horse goes in the right direction. By now the sky is deep blue. The moon above at the colossal tiers is paled beside the lamps which illuminate the arena, and seen from above, the silhouette at intervals against the oval space of acid green grass, the horses, bucking till the head meets their tail between their feet, perform unimaginable twisting and contortions. The cowboys and cowgirls appear to be the children of some superhuman, steel bones and rubber flesh, thighs like pincers, eyes incalculable, and courage unconquered. The cowboy and cowgirl contestants thrilled the spectators at the Wembley Rodeo for 13 days. The contests included bareback bronc riding, fancy roping, cowgirls bronc riding, steer roping, cowgirls trick riding, cowboys bronc riding with saddle, cowboys relay race, steer wrestling, cowboy trick riding, wild steer riding, wild horse race. All the cowboys and the cowgirls were excited and ready to show the crowd why they had come, to compete in their various skills, taking home the King's Cup and becoming the world's champion. The crowd was in for a treat. These contestants were the best of the best in their various categories. More than 90,000 people attended the first performance at 2:30 p.m. on Saturday, June 14, 1924. They found the attraction of the Wild West irresistible at Wembley. The Duke and Duchess of York saw the evening performance. This vast audience, which gathered in the stadium for the opening of the rodeo competitions, watched a wonderful display packed with thrills. Feats of extraordinary daring and cleverness with unbroken horses and wild cattle were performed by cowboys in picturesque green and scarlet shirts and white sombreros and multicolored scarves, and by seemingly reckless cowgirls, daintily robust in black breeches and scarlet shirts. There were falls galore and what looked like hairbreadth escapes. The girls showed amazing dexterity and fearlessness. Here's a record of the thrills in brief. In the Curl Girls' bronc riding on Monday, the horses were very vicious, and 2 girls were badly thrown, one being flung right over the horse's head, and the animal fell upon her. She was rescued by 2 cowboys, but unfortunately her collarbone was broken. The cowboy riding bareback on broncos was most exciting, and many of the riders were thrown in a very few seconds. The cowboy clown, Red Sublet, and his well-trained mule, Sparkplug, do much to amuse the audience. Great interest is sure to be aroused by the cowboys' relay race. This is a mile race, each competitor having 2 horses, and each horse doing 2 laps of a quarter of a mile. Then on the word go, every competitor rides 1 lap, transfers his saddle to his second horse, rides another lap, transfers the saddle to his original horse, and rides a 3rd lap. The same procedure is repeated for the 4th lap. Rodeo is a part of the everyday life of the cowboy on the ranch, but never before have cowboys and cowgirls from all parts of the world been brought together in competition as in the case at the stadium. The evening performance, there were 60,000 people in attendance, and a mighty cheer went up as the band of the Grenadier Guards, headed by the drum major in his enormous busby, which is a headgear or hat, marched across the arena to be followed on its way back by the 120 cowboys and 15 cowgirls mounted on beautiful horses. After this grand entry, the judges of the contest and Tex Austin, the organizer, were introduced. The program of thrills and excitement soon began, and for 2 hours and a half the witnessed bronc riding, bareback bronc riding, fancy roping, bareback bronc riding by cowgirls, trick riding by cowgirls, bronc riding with saddle, cowboys relay race, steer wrestling, trick riding by cowboys, wild steer riding, and a wild horse race. The cowboys excel in lassoing, and it is claimed that those at the stadium now have no equals in the world either on the plains of Argentina, Texas, Venezuela, or Brazil, and such a claim can well be believed, especially after one has watched the lassoing of a horse and rider by a cowboy standing on his head. The trick riding by both cowboys and cowgirls is marvelous, but nothing is more wonderful than the feat by the cowboy who, galloping at full speed across the arena, dives underneath the horse's belly on the near side and comes up onto his saddle on the other side. The reason for the popularity of the rodeo at the stadium is because it is a representation of real life on the ranch. Riding backwards is not an easy task. D.C. Wallet of Westburn is thrown. He gave it a valiant chance. Valiant ride. The cowgirls were less energetic than their menfolk, but even more attractive. In the bronc riding they competed on the level terms with the cowboys, hanging on by a single rein halter until the judge's whistle blew, or the saddle emptier proved the victor. Anita Studnick was picked up with a broken collarbone, but otherwise the cowgirls suffered no ill effects, or at any rate no ill effects which were discernible. Even more to the fancy of the Wembley crowd was the cowgirls' trick riding. Going at full gallop from one end of the vast arena to the other, a girl stood upright on her horse's back, or crawled under its belly and regained her saddle on the other side. Vera McGinnis quickly established her popularity with the crowd by her daredevil tricks. Before the rodeo fortnight ends, she will be as famous as a musical comedy star, and the Johnnies will know her as Vera. Very interesting, too, was the aid the cowgirls gave to the lariat throwers. Galloping at full speed, they allowed the cowboys to rope them as they passed, and the cowboys never seemed to miss. Each time the lariat flew, a horse and rider were brought to a standstill. One cowboy and cowgirl pirouetted around the stadium, the man curling his lariat around himself and his companion in a strange rope dance. Red Sublet, taking it easy. Mart Thompson, along with the other cowboys, are posing for a picture. Mart is the sixth from the right, sitting on the ground. Tom Kernan, the world's champion with a lasso, actually stood on his head, with the loop of the lariat on the ground in front of him, and yet was able to catch two riders as they galloped past. Finally, using two ropes, Kernan caught both rider and horse as they swept past, one lariat encircling the horse's head and the other the cowgirl's body. E.J. Corbett of Slough takes a tumble. He too gave it a shot and found it was tougher than he thought. D.C. Wallet of Westburn is also thrown. These were days never to be forgotten. The crowds of people, the things that were seen from all over the world. It was an amazing, amazing experience and wonderful new friends. The greatest interest expressed by the cowboys during their 12-mile trip to Wembley came when they sighted the Marble Arch entrance to Hyde Park and learned that the king rides there daily at 8 in the morning. All the cowgirls and most of their consorts have enthusiastically declared that they are going to line up in Rotten Row and say howdy to the top-hand rider of the British Empire. Two cowgirls pose on a Bactrian camel, which is held by its keeper, during a visit to the London Zoo in 1924. A cowgirl strands two llamas during the visit to the London Zoo in 1924. The cowgirls performed to over 100,000 people at Wembley Stadium in June. The cowgirls and the cowboys, it was a huge success. Cowboys and a trainer with a female Indian elephant, Sundarmala, during a visit to the London Zoo in 1924. "40-odd acres of ground have been built over to form the Wembley Amusement Park. It will take at least a full day to experience the 202 side shows. There are the steepest alpine railways in the world, They provide a delirium of speed as the trolleys race and crash breathlessly through scenic gorges and over swirling torrents to the heart-easing calm, with the exit and another ride around if you want one. A water chute slides down 80 feet of sensation to bounce and prance in wings of spray on a lake beneath. A safety racer is the last word in switchbacks. The cars start level from a pinnacle and rush down together along the dipping and turning track. The swaying of the cars' crews add to the speed, and the crew that stays on the cars the most will win. Imagine the paradox of a vast miniature. Even then you will only begin to have an inkling of the wonder and the impressiveness of what is philosophically called the overseas section of the British Empire exhibition. A section, yet it spreads over dozens of fascinating acres, represents the lives and the industries of a string of differing races, throws the East into startlingly sharp contrast with the West, tells a tale of almost incredible natural wealth and resources allied to the human ingenuity, endeavor, and achievement. Even the section baffles and bewilders while it inspires. One passes from the astounding virility of Canada and Australia to the mud walls of West Africa, along to the rioting color and romance of India, across tinkling bells and dim-lit mysticism of Burma, back a few yards and up Union Approach to see the wonders of South Africa, with its diamond washing plant, its ostriches, and its rich abundance of products, and so on through the wonders of New Zealand, Newfoundland, Ceylon, Hong Kong, and Malaya. It seems like a fairyland journey, along which is displayed inaccessible mineral wealth, jewels, and precious possessions of rare kinds, the fruits of the earth in an almost unimaginable abundance, the cunning craftsmanship of a colored native race displayed within a stone's throw of the great productive inventions of other countries, which count it a proud distinction to figure under the heading of a section of the British Empire. South Africa has rather happily broken away from the more or less stereotyped style of exhibition buildings, with a pavilion which, with its step, STOEP, and loggia, LOGGIA, its tiled roof and its gables, gives atmosphere even before one enters to wander among the ostrich feathers, the diamond washing plant, the native animals which perch on or crouch among rocks and sands. Here again the general impression is one of incalculable natural resources. The ostrich paddock outside and the train, in the dining cars of which meals are served, are admirable sideshows, especially when one contrasts the train with a stagecoach down from the veldt, VELDT. Canada, like Australia, is complete, and the chief impression one gets in her building is the remarkable nature of her industrial progress. Her mineral wealth seems inexhaustible, and her forestry and fruit exhibits are impressive in their plenitude, but one walks along to New Zealand natural history exhibits, the sporting trophies, and the fishes, with a feeling that in Canada there has developed a great manufacturing community, the existence of which one had not before realized. Breathing time between the thrills gives a chance to the quieter sideshows. Wembley has the nearest thing to a real coal mine that has ever come out of South Wales. The cages run to a depth of 50 feet in the London clay, bricked and painted to a proper blackness. Pit ponies haul the trams to the coal surface, where the hewers are working in uncomfortable places. It is all as real as reproduction can ever be, and gives us a true idea of what the miner's underground life is like. No wonder that at last one comes again out into the open and makes for the switchback, the dodgem, the witching waves, or whatnot, to make certain that after all one is normally alive and not bewitched. But after the riotous joys of the amusement park comes back the newly found knowledge of what the empire means and what it is. That is the knowledge that will live. That is why Wembley was created. But it will be the might of the empire that the men and the women, and especially the children, will remember long after they have forgotten how the scenic railway or the water chute made them gasp joyously for breath as they made headlong and safely terrifying descents. Let us become globetrotters, and as everything is done magically at Wembley, let us leap straight into Australia. The Wembley, Australia, is as large as the whole of Olympia. It is confined within a great white building that takes up nearly 6 acres of space. There is a sheep run with a mechanical shearer at work, a cattle station, a working model of a farm, a fruit farm with apples hanging from the trees, a sawmill, a vineyard, great stacks of timber, wines, wool, meat, manufactured articles, so much that you might think you have seen the whole of the exhibition until you go next door into Canada. Covering over 200 acres, the exhibition site included pavilions displaying the produce, industries, and crafts of the different colonies and dominions. These were developed and organized by the respective colonial governments. 56 out of 58 territories participated with their displays and pavilions. There were also over 40 different cafes, restaurants, and places of refreshment, a children's creche, and the Treasure Island attraction, which boasted a miniature train. Visitors could learn about developments in consumer goods, including fabrics, appliances, and processed foods, in the Palace of Industry, and explore electrical, automotive, and aeronautics industries in the Palace of Engineering. Other exhibits of note include Queen Mary's famous doll's house and a butter sculpture of the Prince of Wales in the dairy produce section of the Canadian Pavilion. The exhibition was opened for 6 months in 1924 and reopened again in 1925. Over the course of its opening, it attracted over 25 million visitors. Live animals were also on display, including elephants named Simla and Saucy. The pavilions for individual countries included a variety of displays showcasing produce, crafts, and industries. The India Pavilion was modeled on the Jama Masjid in Delhi and the Taj Mahal in Agra, and contained 27 courts displaying different products as well as an exhibition of Indian art. The pavilions for individual countries included a variety of displays showcasing produce, crafts, and industries. The India Pavilion was modeled on the Jama Masjid in Delhi and the Taj Mahal in Agra, and contained 27 courts displaying different products as well as an exhibition of Indian art. In addition to the pavilions and kiosks, there was a lake, a fun fair, a garden, and a working replica coal mine. There were also numerous restaurants, the most expensive of which was the Lucilia's restaurant near the exhibition gardens. After admission, most of the attractions in the grounds were free. They could also be explored after dark. The various buildings of the site were linked by 2 light railways of unusual construction, the screw-propelled never-stop railway and the road rails line on which trains were hauled by steam or petrol tractors guided by the rails, but with driving wheels running on the ground outside the track. Visitors could also travel in electric railroad buses, little more than basic railway station luggage trolleys, fitted with open-sided bodywork, but exciting nevertheless. The exhibition showcased produce and manufactured goods, arts and crafts, as well as historical artifacts from each of the dominions, the Indian Empire, as well as Britain's African and Caribbean colonies. The exhibition was also accompanied by a cultural program and a series of conferences. Britain focused on its textiles, chemicals, and engineering, and was keen to emphasize its central role in ensuring progress for the whole of the empire. The Ceylon Pavilion was modeled on the Temple of the Tooth in Kandy and displayed valuable collections of jewelry and gemstones. Built by architects Charles Allam and Sons, The India Pavilion was modeled on the Jama Masjid in Delhi and the Taj Mahal in Agra. The White Building was divided into 27 courts, each dedicated to the exhibition of products from one of the 27 Indian provinces. It was one of the few pavilions where food was served. It also hosted an exhibition on Indian art, curated by the India Society. The cumulative effect is almost overwhelming, but even so one has only seen the miniature, although a very remarkable one, of all that is represented by far-stretching tracts of territory, peopled here by scattered pioneers and there by dark-skinned men and women, whose history stretches away back into the misty distances of historic centuries. And a few yards away, men and women and children rescue themselves from their bewilderment by paddling into little boats on cunningly contrived lakes, sipping tea in well-appointed cafes, or careering up and down a switchback in the amusement park. They are bound to do it. The wonderment of it all. So at last to Burma, one of the show pavilions of the exhibition. The pavilion was built in Burma itself and carefully transported. It is a marvel of tapering steeples, whose delicately carved tracery makes weird patterns against the skyline. Monster legogryphs, Leogriffs, guard it from the shadows of great scarlet columns. Around it runs a Burmese garden. Inside there is revealed the life of a typical Burmese village, with its natives at their work and their play. And so one goes, and if the voyager is wise, he will leave India and Burma until the last. India is wonderful. There is a great white pillared and towered pavilion running along the three sides of a square. Domes and minarets reach up from it into the Wembley sky. In the square itself is a blue-watered lake and a spacious courtyard, while the pavilion houses products whose colors dazzle and whose cunningly devised symbolism reeks of romance, and dark-skinned men and women tell you something of the mysteries of the East. Inspired by trottoir roulant or moving pavement in Paris in 1900, William Yorth Lewis set out to design a system of continuous transport with the intention of replacing the current underground system in London. Teaming up with Benjamin Ratcliffe Atkins in the 1900s, the two patented the Atkins-Lewis system of continuous transport. Initial trials were carried out at Ipswich to demonstrate the transportation system before being relocated to Aldwych for public demonstrations. This unusual transport system sits on two rails and is driven by a giant screw underneath the carriages. As the carriages come into the station, the coil of the screw gets tighter, slowing them down. Meanwhile, between the stations, the coils are more loosely spaced, increasing the speed at which the carriages travel. As the name suggests, the carriages never come to a complete stop, and passengers are expected to hop off while it is still in motion. The lack of stopping meant that the railway was able to get a greater average speed than the trains being run in the London Underground at the time. Lewis was extremely passionate about his system. He also entered a competition in Paris in 1922 that invited contestants to design an alternative method of transport to those currently used in the city. This led to the formation of the Never Stop Transit Limited, NST. Shortly after entering this competition, the Never Stop Transit entered into an agreement with the British Empire Exhibition Committee to build a system for the British Empire Exhibition. The Never Stop Railway was finally built for the 1924 British Empire Exhibition and transported visitors around the Wembley site during the exhibition in 1924 and 1925. Witching waves, the dodgem, the whip, or some others in motion runs on disordered lines. There are others without end. Indeed, the worst effects of a bad channel crossing can easily be reproduced in the admission parks. Then there are things of uncomfortable and disorderly motion, instruments for bouncing and bumping and laughter. Jack and Jill, for example, where the couples come along, tumbling down the slippery slope of a high hill as gracefully as they may, to the cheerful embarrassment of themselves and the delight of the onlookers. A special railway loop line and station were built to connect the site to London Marylebone Station. The various buildings of the site were linked by several light railways, including the screw-driven Never Stop Railway. Mart participated in the saddle bronc and bareback bronc riding as well as the wild horse races. The McLeod Times reported Mart was expected to take a good portion of the $75,000 prize money. Many expected he would bring home the King's Cup. However, on the final day, Mart met with a bottle of champagne, which proved to be tougher than the broncs Mart had been making those sensational rides on. As a result of his bout with the champagne, Mart didn't receive the King's Cup, but he was named Canadian All-Around Cowboy and made good day money, as it was called, for several days. Although Mart continued to ride broncs and participate in rodeos, competing with the best of the cowboys, he never again challenged a bottle of champagne. These were days never to be forgotten. For some, it would be the only opportunity to travel across the ocean to compete with champions. It was an exciting time. For all, the opportunity to participate in the first International British Exhibition, 1924 Wembley Rodeo, was a dream come true. Whether they won or lost, they were still winners. They competed with the best in the world, got to see other nations and peoples, and made new friends. At the end of the rodeo, the Kernans headed off to Paris. Others, including Skeeter Bill Robbins and Dorothy Merrill, headed back to the United States on the SS Menominee. The ship had good accommodations for the horses. A year before, the British Army had shipped 40 polo ponies to the United States. Thus, there were nice white stalls padded with peat moss for the horses. The ship, however, was generally used for the immigrant trade. The Menominee arrived in New York July 20th, 1924. Monocles, spats, Malaco shoes, and gaily colored English sweaters were among the items of the 117 members of the American Rodeo Company who returned on the steamer Menominee today after 4 weeks of performing at the British Empire Exhibition at Wembley, England. The cowpunchers expressed warm appreciation of the warm hospitality shown them by their British hosts. They said their shows were heartily applauded and generally well liked by the great crowds that turned out to see them. The charges of cruelty made against them, they said, came from elderly English spinsters who did not attend the shows. To add insult to injury to the minuscule purse, the Canadians discovered that Austin was about to leave them stranded in New York, without the promised car fare back to Alberta. The Canadians complained to the British consulate. At the time, Canadians were regarded as British subjects, and thus entitled to the intervention and protection of the British Foreign Service. A few words from the British consulate and Tex Austin saw the light. The Canadians were on their way home. Mart arrived home the end of July. Mart said, "Oh, it's all right going to burgs like London, where you can't see the town for the buildings, where they don't know anything about roping horses or riding the bucking horse, except what they see from us who go there. We had a good trip and saw a great deal. It was worth going to see. Some of the boys were broke at times, but that's nothing. Yes, I am glad to be home again, and will now settle down to work until next year, when these stampedes start again. I heard all about your great jubilee in McLeod while we were in New York." Edna Pearl McNabb, known as Molly, was born the 9th of July, 1898, in McLeod, Northwest Territories. Alberta did not become a province until 1905. She died the 6th of September, 1953, in Fort Macleod, Alberta. Her father, Robert Burgess McNabb, was born the 4th of January 1862 in Ballinrobe, County Mayo, Ireland, and died the 1st of November 1942 in Fort Macleod, Alberta. Her mother, Mary Casson Barker McNabb, was born the 6th of May 1865 in Liverpool, Lancashire, England, and died the 5th of November 1956 in Fort Macleod, Alberta. Mary and her husband Robert resided at Slideout. One time there was a flood. They could see their home floating. Their home had been washed away to the far bluff in the Valley River. They rebuilt their home and named it Slideout. When Mart arrived home from the Wembley Rodeo, he participated in several rodeos, from Fort Macleod, Staveley, Claresholm, Pincher Creek, Olson Creek, Calgary, Granham, Wolford, and so on. During this time, he was courting his sweet Molly. Mart and Molly were married on the 16th of December 1928 in Fort Macleod. Finally, his sweet Molly was now his wife. How sweet it was! How he loved her! Robert Charles, known as Chuck Thompson, was born the 2nd of April 1930 in McLeod, Alberta. At this time, Mart and Molly were renting a home on the Belly River, not far from Molly's parents, Robert and Mary McNabb. Frances Mary Thompson was born the 20th of June 1931 in Fort Macleod. Dorothy Margaret Heathcote Thompson was born the 14th of December 1932 in Fort Macleod. Joyce Lorraine Thompson was born the 15th of August 1934 in Fort Macleod. Merle Elizabeth Thompson was born the 14th of March 1936 in Lethbridge. Walter Ray, known as Ray Thompson, was born the 27th of December 1940 in Fort Macleod. Mart and Molly worked hard to provide a home for their family. When Chuck was a little older, Mart and Molly's family had moved closer to the Longbottom School. Chuck would ride Pally to the Longbottom School and Pierce School about 1938, with Dorothy and Joyce riding behind. He loved horses. This was the same horse that Mart had used when he courted his sweetheart Molly. Mart loved his family. They were his world. Ray and Merle Thompson, Merle Thompson. In 1947, their home burned. They were living by the Longbottom School at this time. The house was in flames. Mart ran into the home and, reaching up above the door on the inside, grabbed the photo of Tex Austin International Contest, Wembley, 1924. This was all that he could save. It was the only remaining item from what he had brought home as souvenirs. Everything else went up in flames. Helen Thompson, Mart's sister, on the left is with Molly, Mart's wife, on the right. Helen Thompson, Mart's sister, is holding Ray Thompson. The children are growing. Ray Thompson at the old Doc Carey place when he was 4. Chuck Thompson, Merle Thompson, Joyce Thompson, Ray and Merle Thompson, Ray Thompson, Frances Thompson, Molly with her daughters Dorothy, Frances, and Joyce. Chuck worked on the bridge crew. As he grew older, Mary Elizabeth Hunter caught his eye. She was very beautiful. She went to school in Orton. They met at a dance in Fort Macleod. After courting for a time, Chuck and Mary were married on the 12th of April, 1952 in Fort Macleod. Mary Elizabeth Hunter was born the 9th of October, 1934 in Fort Macleod. Chuck and Mary have 4 children: Wanda Pearl, Edie Mary Darlene, Trina Merle, and Gary Charles. Mart hunted to provide meat for his family in the winter. He would take his sons Chuck and Ray hunting for deer and elk in the mountains. Chuck Thompson takes after his father Mart. Chuck loves working with horses and cattle. He worked at the Macleod auction market in Fort Macleod and was the brand inspector for the Lethbridge office in Alberta when he retired. He is very good with animals. At the time of this video, 2024, Chuck is 94 years old. Mart worked for the town of Fort Macleod on the Department of Highways. He was a hard, dependable worker. Mart Thompson passed away on July 5, 1965 in Fort Macleod, Alberta, at the age of 66. He was born the 19th of February, 1899 in Pinewood, Buzzell Township, Beltrami County, Minnesota. He came with his family in 1907 to settle in the Beaver Creek district west of Fort Macleod, where he took his schooling. When a young man, he was very active as a rodeo contestant, and in 1923 earned the reputation of being one of the few cowboys to ride Midnight, the famous bucking horse, owned by Jim McNabb. Mart was honored to be chosen as one of the cowboys to represent Canada in a month-long rodeo at the World Exhibition held at Wembley Stadium in England in 1924. He married Edna Pearl McNabb in Fort Macleod in 1928, and they ranched and farmed in the Pierce District until 1946, when he joined the staff of the Department of Highways, retiring in December of 1964. Edna Pearl Thompson predeceased her husband on September 6, 1953.
I can't forget the day that I was born. Was on a cold and frosty winter's morn. The doctor said I was a chubby chap, but when the nurse she took me on her lap, she washed me all over, I remember, and after powder puffing me, you see, she laid me in the cradle by the window, in the little shirt my mother made for me. When I began to crawl, it was a sight. I used to frighten Mom from morn till night. There's no mistake, I was a little Turk, for when my daddy he came home from work, Every night he would say, "Where's little Sam got?" As down the kitchen happy as could be. They used to find me scraping out the jam pot in the little shirt my mother made for me. The first day that I wore my knickerbox, I felt so funny after wearing smocks. I looked a little picture, they did say, but when they let me out to run and play, well, I didn't like the breeches I was wearing, and in the street I took 'em off, you see. I started walking home so bold and daring in the little shirt my mother made for me. Last year when I was on my holidays, up on the briny ocean I did gaze. The water looked so nice I thought I'd go to have a swim, but in a minute, oh, all the girls along the beach at me were staring, and some were taking pictures I could see. Was a good thing for me that I was wearing the little shirt my mother made for me.